Ladies and gents, welcome to another episode of Optimize Your Body podcast. Got another awesome guest here today. Goes by the name of Paul Taylor, and Paul's a former British Royal Navy aircrew officer. If that's right, my man, to start with.
That is right, correct.
Awesome. And are you actually still right now? Are you still completing a PhD in applied psychology, or is that?
I am. Yes, I'm hopefully in the last 6 months of the friggin' saga, and then I'm done.
And then you're
No
done.
more study.
No, I was going to say, man, I was literally trying to do the calculation. I'm thinking, how has this guy fitted this much, like this many bloody qualifications into his resume, right? Because I know you're a professor at San Francisco as well, right? The University of San Fran. How long was it for?
Former adjunct professor.
Wow.
So that's just like an overseas professor. So I did that for a few years.
Got it.
And studied nutrition and neuroscience and XPhys, and now I'm on psychology. It's the last piece of the jigsaw for me.
Wow. Talk us through that as well, though, man. I'd love to know, because I know you were in the, obviously, Royal Navy. Let's not touch over that, skim over it. My dad was actually in the Welsh Guards.
Oh, was he? Okay.
Unfortunately, when they went to Falklands back in the day, you know?
Ooh, fucking hell.
So, yeah. But, so he was in the Welsh Guards and the Royal Navy. So how long were you in the Navy for?
8 years. So I was an aircrew officer. So you do a year's officer training, then 2 years of flying training, and then 5 years return of service. And I was very lucky. The vast majority of my professional stuff was done up in Scotland on the west coast in Prestwick. I did anti-submarine warfare there for a few years, and then I did helicopter search and rescue for my last 2.5 years, and that was the best job in the military.
Really?
Oh, man, it was absolutely, well, I kind of describe it as sort of 50% excitement, 30% boredom, and 20% terror.
What was the most exciting part for you? No doubt the 20%.
I mean, it was all the flying. The flying up there is just phenomenal. Like, because we would do lots of, flying training. You do confined area landings, cliff winching, low level navigations down to 50 feet. So a search and rescue were cleared down to 50 feet. And yeah, the flying was awesome. Some of the jobs were challenging, but pretty awesome stuff.
And no doubt. What time did you join the Royal Navy?
I joined in 1997.
1997. How old were you then?
I was actually pretty old. I was 25. I was just turned 26, I think. I just sneaked in under the cutoff. Actually, there's a little story about that. I was supposed to join. I passed selection for Royal Marines officer. And went traveling with a mate of mine who had also passed for Royal Marines, and we were supposed to start in the May batch. And we got to Australia, and I got a letter from my careers officer saying that he forgot to submit my final forms. So I missed the May batch and was going to be joining in September, but I'd actually exceeded the age limit.
Oh.
We said, if they get too many passes, you're first out because you're now too old. And that's exactly what happened.
Wow, that's interesting. Let's get into that, right? Because I am curious about that as well, just for the audience, and they're probably wondering, where is that accent from? He's from Belfast in Northern Ireland, right? And then you live in Melbourne, Australia. Talk us through, this is such an interesting thing in terms of how you ended up here. You were going to go in the Marines, missed the cutoff, then you joined the Navy. Talk us through that, man.
Yeah. So like I said, I was going to join the Marines, and then missed that age cutoff. My mate went and joined the Marines. And then I joined the Navy because they had an extra year. So I did my flying aptitude test. I just about passed for pilot. But did pretty well on navigator. They call them observers. And spoke to my careers officer, and he said, look, you can join as a pilot if you want, but with that score, you're probably going to struggle. Whereas I think you'd find the navigation stuff quite easy. And then you can go on and do your all arms commando course, get your Green Beret and work with them, which never friggin' happen. They sell you a dream, and it doesn't happen. But actually, in retrospect, I'm glad the way that it worked out, because I think I had a much more interesting career flying in the Navy, particularly where I ended up doing search and rescue, than I would have had in the Marines. So, you just gotta wait to see how these things play out. So I'd done a master's in sports science before I joined. And then when I was doing search and rescue, I knew I was going to be leaving. So I did another master's in nutrition part-time, which I wouldn't have been able to do if I'd have been in the Marines. But because I was doing search and rescue, you know, you have quite a bit of time off and you can work and do stuff. And they were pretty flexible, actually. They were very good at letting me attend the lectures. And then I left the military. I met a young lady traveling in Ecuador while I was still in the military. She was an Aussie. And she moved over to Scotland with me for a while. She had been living in the States and then dragged me kicking and screaming all the way here, mate.
Oh, really? Is that how it happened? Yeah.
I wasn't kicking and screaming. I was mad for it.
I was gonna say,
do you want to come and live in Australia? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay, yeah, exactly. Not even a hesitation.
Yeah, you know what it's like where we're from, right? There's 100%. No friggin' sun. The weather is shit. It rains all the time. 100%. And if you get the opportunity to go to Australia, you take somebody's arm off for it.
100%. You know what's interesting as well is about the accent. I'd love to know, because most of my audience are actually in America, and the accent, right? Now I'm listening to you. I'm like, yeah, you sound like 90% like you're from Northern Ireland, but I can still hear little kind of like some of the tonality is like, yeah, that's Aussie. That was Aussie, that word. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Look, when I go back to Ireland, which I'm doing in December, actually, people say I sound completely Australian, right? Whereas my kids are like, what are you talking about? I don't sound like an Aussie at all. So a bit creeps into it. There's probably a little bit of Scottish in there because I lived for 5 years in Glasgow.
That's the most hardest. Even for me, that's the hardest accent to understand, man. You get a Norwegian who's speaking at the normal pace they speak at. Good luck.
Yeah, Glaswegians, I can on northeast coast like Aberdeen. I have no idea what these guys are saying, right?
Really?
When you get up into the Highlands, particularly around Aberdeen, it's like they're speaking a different language. But you know what it's like, right? In the UK, you go 50 miles down the road and the accent changes completely. Whereas in Australia, you can go 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers, as they would say. And there's no discernible difference until you get to Queensland and they just speak a bit slower.
100%. Like where I'm from in Cardiff in Wales, if you go literally 10 miles up the motorway to Newport, for example, right? Completely different. Bridgend, it's all different. Like, and then you've got the valleys, which is another animal.
Yeah, the valleys.
The valleys, but I'd love to get into what kind of inspired you, my man, to get into, because I'm so fascinated with the human brain and neuroscience and stuff. I'd love to know what took you from, you know, exercise physiologist or, you know, sports science degree, and then took you down the road of, you know, neuroscience and being a
So it was when I came over here, I started off as a physiologist and nutritionist. I went to see a guy called Craig Hart. The best bit of advice I got from my resettlement officer, he said, just go and talk to everybody who's in your industry. And your last question should be, who should I talk to next? So I ended up, this guy, Craig Harper, who owned the biggest personal training studio in the Southern Hemisphere. And I went in to have a chat with him. He almost didn't talk to me, and we ended up chatting for 2 hours. And so I opened up my business inside of his as an exercise physiologist and nutritionist. He had about 35 personal trainers in there. It was a great, really great environment. And I was working with clients and, you know, telling them, giving them all my knowledge around nutrition and exercise science and all of that. And realized over time that it's not about telling people what to do. It's not about knowledge transfer. It's about behavior change. And that's why I went back to uni and studied neuroscience, because I really wanted to understand the brain and how it worked, and particularly around behavior change. So I did that. And then I started talking about the brain. So as I getting interested in the brain, then obviously nutrition plays a huge role. Exercise plays a massive role. So I did a deep dive into that, and was probably the first person in Australia who started talking about the brain benefits of exercise. You know, this is nearly 20 years ago. I was presenting at Philex, which was the fitness convention, and sort of kind of eked out a little speciality around the brain and exercise and nutrition and behavior change and everything to do that. And it was pretty fascinating. So that's then obviously led me now to doing my PhD, which I always wanted to do, but didn't have the time to do it. So I'm doing that in psychology. So for me, that's the kind of last piece of the puzzle to really understand and influence human behavior.
Yeah, behavior changes. Exactly. I've been on a similar journey myself. I started PTing people when I was 19. I'm 37 now. So a long time in the industry. Now I'm online, right? So I do nutrition coaching primarily, but everything I do now is all about behavior changes. Like, right, how can we change? And that's the only way you can really make progress, right? Is how do you pick a behavior turn that into a habit. And again, it's not the information, right? It's actually really
Yeah.
simple. And most people actually know what to do. It's just, okay, how do I, people overwhelm themselves, try and change too much at once. And the reality is, I'd love to get into that, though, right? Because I know, shout out your book as well. It's called Death by Comfort, How Modern Life is Killing Us and What We Can Do About It. So go check that out. I'll put that in the show notes. I'd love to know what kind of, what you unpacked in that book. I haven't read the whole book, to be honest, what you unpacked in that book and what, again, what inspired you. You mentioned behavior change to put that book together.
What really inspired me was just it was written out of almost a bit of a sense of despair about where we're going as a human species, right? We are the most overweight, most depressed, most medicated, and most addicted cohort of adults that there's ever been, yet life has never been so good. We have it easier than all of our ancestors, yet we are going through what we can only describe as a twin physical and mental health crisis, right? We look at this country, 66% of people are overweight or obese. In America, where lots of your listeners are, it's even worse. Now in America, obesity, some states in America have 40% of the population that is obese. And our mental health is going down the gurgler. And it's getting worse. And it's due to lifestyle. It's the fact that we are ancient bodies and brains in a modern world, right? The human genome hasn't changed in over 45,000 years, right? No significant change. So we are still this hunter-gatherer's genome that has been plonked in this modern world where there is comfort and convenience all around us. And we're hardwired as a species to take advantage of that, because when you're a hunter-gatherer, life is friggin' hard, and so any sense of comfort, you dive into it, and that helps with balance. But now we have comfort and convenience everywhere, and it's actually just destroying us, right? We don't move anymore, and physical exercise is fundamental to our biology. In this country, more than 50% of all food eaten is ultra processed shit. In the United States, it's almost 70%, right? And that is destroying our biology. We are more digitally connected, but less socially connected than we've ever been. And most people's sleep hygiene is shithouse. And if you mess with sleep, you mess with your biology. If you mess with physical activity, if you're sedentary, you mess with your biology. If you eat a shit diet, you mess with your biology. So if you're the average American, Australian, or Brit, or who doesn't move very much, eats crap food, a lot of their diet being crap food, and has poor sleep hygiene, you're playing Russian roulette with your physical and mental health. So that's a very long-winded way of saying this was written out of a kind of a sense of despair of where we're going wrong. And I wanted to highlight it to people that it's our environment that we're in that is setting us up to fail. And it's that comfort that is so appealing that is useful for hunter-gatherers, but absolutely destroys us.
And you've mentioned, right, on the summary of your book, embracing discomfort, right? And I love that.
Yeah.
You mentioned things like, cold showers, fasting, and you mentioned digital sunsets as well. Is that having, time away from?
Yeah, absolutely. This is like ideally an hour before. That's the ideal word. But most people, you say an hour before you go to bed, turn off all devices that fucking look at you like you're wearing a fur-lined Viking hat, right?
Wait, that's the big challenge I have with clients. That one.
Yeah. So what I find that kind of lands with people, having done workshops to thousands of people, is 30 minutes. Most people go, an hour, no way, but yeah, I can do 30 minutes, right?
That's exactly what I've been doing, yeah.
And just having 30 minutes without digital inputs, right? So what we know is the worst thing for your sleep is combining blue light with cognitively stimulating activities. So think doing work, answering emails, Netflix, watching TV, or scrolling on social media. They're all cognitively stimulating, and they all involve blue light, which interferes with our melatonin that impacts on our ability to sleep. But we're also getting cognitively stimulated. Your brain needs time to decompress and to wind down and prepare for sleep. And so that's why a digital detox, I think, is hugely important. And especially for kids, like I am shocked how many kids are allowed to have devices in their bedrooms. And I'm pretty hardcore on this. I say, if you're a parent who allows their children to have a device in their bedroom, that is tantamount to child abuse. We know that kids who have a device in their bedroom sleep on average an hour to an hour and a half less than their peers and have significantly increased risk for mental illness, right?
Makes
And
perfect sense to me. Yeah.
it's just, yeah, like when you get into sleep biology, you just see the impact. Like if you've had a shit night's sleep, either because you're delayed getting to sleep or you're waking up in the middle of the night, what happens the next day is cortisol is higher the entire next day, the major stress hormone, right? So you're more stressed the next day. What is also higher the next day is ghrelin, the major hunger hormone. So you eat more food. And because cortisol is high, that makes you crave sugary, fatty, and salty foods. Because long-term cortisol was about famine. And so it drives you to seek those foods. And then what is lower the entire next day is leptin. So leptin has a powerful action on voluntary physical activity. It's a neurohormone. So it's a hormone that acts in the brain. And when they block the leptin gene on mice and rats, within a month, they become obese. They stop moving and they overeat. So leptin does two things in the brain. It drives you to move more and it's cessation of eating. So leptin is stored in our fat. So as you start to put on weight, what will happen is your brain basically goes, hey, Martin, being a bit of a slob, you need to move more and eat less to bring you back to that set point, right? Now, what we know is that you can become leptin resistant, right? So for me, there's the triumvirate that destroys people's metabolism: insulin resistance, glucocorticoid or cortisol resistance, and leptin resistance, right? They all have these feedback mechanisms that self-regulate, but we can overcome those feedback mechanisms by eating shit food, by being constantly stressed. And then when you develop resistance, you've got no homeostatic feedback. So you go completely out of balance. And that's how people become massively overweight, develop diabetes, and develop mental illness as well. So, and that's just sleep biology, right? And then, you throw exercise and nutrition into the mix. Like when people are eating lots of ultra processed foods, as they do, they are completely destroying their biology. And geez, we haven't even talked about movement yet.
No, exactly. Let's talk. I want to go a little bit deeper on this sleep one though, right? Because you explain it so well and so digestible. And it's such a challenging one with sleep because people, let's say they're overweight. They're like, just give me the workout plan. I'll do the work. And they almost like they don't take sleep seriously because they haven't actually got enough awareness with it. And if I'm honest, even I find myself, it's actually the hardest thing for me to like master in terms of discipline, bedtime routine, being on point. And since I've done that over the last, say, 4 years, I started tracking my sleep. I used Whoop initially, then it was Aura. Yeah. That took me to a whole new level. But people think that like sleep is just something that just happens, right? It's like and I have this when I ask people about their sleep and I unpack it, they're like, yeah, I hit the pillow and sleep great. And it's like, it doesn't work like that. You can't. And they're like, no, it's fine. I stay on my phone. And no, it doesn't work like that, right? You're not aware because you haven't come away from it long enough. And I don't know if you notice this now, right? But if I do it now, I'm actually super aware now of the blue lights. I wear those blue blockers, of course, but I'm actually super aware now. If I take them off, I'm like, you feel the stimulation, right? Like that cortisol,
Yeah. And it's not just the getting to sleep, it's the waking up. And it's also the amount of time that you're spending in deep sleep and REM sleep as well, right? So what we know is when you're asleep, magic happens in the human brain. So two things that I really want to touch on. In REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, what actually happens, Dutch researchers showed this in 2019. They managed to block REM sleep in animals and in humans, and within a week to 2 weeks, they became anxious. They developed proper anxiety. What we now know that happens in the brain in REM sleep is your brain is replaying the day's events, right? So when they put EEG caps on people, they can see a tremendous amount of activity between the temporal and the frontal lobes when you're asleep. So what scientists believe is happening is you're replaying the day's events over in your mind, and you're deciding what's important to store as a memory, right? And what gets deleted, because we have so many inputs. The brain has to do this every night. Turns out this is the only time in your life that norepinephrine is shut down in the brain. So norepinephrine, or noradrenaline, so the Yanks call it epinephrine and norepinephrine, we call it adrenaline and noradrenaline. Think of adrenaline acting in the body, and noradrenaline is the sister chemical in the brain. So at night when you're asleep, your brain shuts down norepinephrine or noradrenaline release from the locus coeruleus in the brain. Now, why is that important? That means that, say me and you had an argument, right? If you are replaying that argument in your brain as it happened, it's going to release stress hormones. So it's just going to wake your ass up, right? And this is when you ask people, if they wake up in the middle of the night, what are you thinking about? They're not thinking about their best holiday ever. They're thinking about shit they need to do or stressful stuff, right? And that's because what happens is when you are very stressed or you're habitually messing with your REM sleep, that switching off of noradrenaline or norepinephrine goes awry, and that's when it leaks in, and then it's stress hormones what wakes you up and says you need to do something about this, right? But if you are in normal REM sleep, you're replaying that argument, but without stress hormone. And what the researchers think is that REM sleep is therapy for the brain. It's like you're just going over that with a psychologist, reducing the emotional intensity of it. Because if you were just to remember all the shit being chased by a tiger or bad stuff happening, you'd never sleep, right? So that's the key thing. So for me, REM sleep is nightly therapy for the brain. And we mess with REM sleep with, there's a few things that alcohol and marijuana particularly mess with REM sleep. And there are a lot of people who will self-medicate for sleep with either alcohol or marijuana, right? And lots of executives that I work with say, I cannot sleep unless I've had a bottle of wine, then I can sleep. And I say to them, you're not asleep, you're unconscious. It's different, right? Mm-hmm. The architecture is completely different. The other thing about sleep is deep sleep. So when you're in deep sleep, magic happens in the brain. Something called the glymphatic system is activated. The brain doesn't have a lymphatic system. And neuroscientists for years were wondering, how the hell does it get rid of toxins? Because neurons, like all other cells, they use oxygen for metabolism and they create waste products. And the lymphatic system in the body gets rid of it, but the brain doesn't have a lymphatic system. And then a genius about 10 years ago discovered something called the glymphatic system, and this has now been confirmed. And what recent research shows is in deep sleep, your glial cells, which are the support cells of the neurons, all vibrate at a certain frequency. And what happens is your neurons shrink and they dump their toxic waste products into the extracellular matrix. And the vibration of your glial cells washes that along into the glymphatic system, and it gets drained out of your brain and dumped into the nearest lymph node and excreted throughout your body. Like, how cool is that shit? What we also know is your DNA repair enzymes kick in when you're asleep. These are little enzymes that run all the way through your body looking for cancerous and precancerous cells. And when they find them, they tag them. And then your natural killer cells come along and execute them. It's pretty cool shit, right? So at night, this is when the brain and the body repairs itself, right? Your brain repairs itself. Your cardiovascular system, your DNA repairs itself. You get rid of cancerous and precancerous cells. This is why people who have chronically bad sleep dramatically increase the risk of neurodegenerative diseases, because they get a buildup of those toxic waste products. They also significantly increase the risk of some forms of cancer, of cardiovascular disease, of obesity, of diabetes, of depression, of anxiety. They destroy their cognitive performance. And for the blokes who are listening to this, 3 nights bad sleep and your balls shrink.
Makes sense.
And your testosterone resembles somebody that's 10 years older, right?
Wow.
So you mess with sleep, you mess with your biology, full stop.
Love Love that. And just to give some people some simple tips, right? The big rocks to focus on when it comes to sleep. For example, with me, I cut water off an hour before bed. Probably should do it sooner, but that seems to work for me. No electronics for me is 90 minutes, but I've been slipping lately. It's been more 60 minutes. Food, I don't have any food. Well, I give it at least 4 hours because I have quite big meals, but they say at least 3 hours. What are the big rocks? And I know you mentioned alcohol and obviously cannabis being the worst too for REM sleep. What are the big rocks you get your high performers to focus on?
So all the ones that you talked about are really important. Not eating too close to bed. I recommend 3 hours around that, because that digestion interferes with sleep. Also get the digital detox that we talked about, right? Minimizing alcohol and marijuana. But the other things that are really important, caffeine, right? So caffeine is a stimulant. They give it to fighter pilots in times of war to keep them awake, right? What most people don't realize is that the half-life of caffeine is about 6 hours for the average person. Now, some people are fast processors, some are slow. What that means is 6 hours later, half that caffeine is still in your system. Now, if you're having 1 or 2 cups of coffee early, that's not an issue. But if you're having 4 or more exposures and the last one after midday or into the afternoon, you will have caffeine in your brain at stimulant levels 24/7, 365 days a year. Right? And people wonder why they struggle with sleep. So the rule that I use is no more than 250 milligrams and try to be done 8 hours before you go to bed. So that's about 3 standard cups of coffee. Now, I drink tea. I drink weak Earl Grey tea. Don't tell my mates from Belfast that I drink French
You won't
Earl
get away
Grey.
with that one.
No, exactly. But I could probably have 10 cups of weak tea for 3 cups of coffee. And then you got to think about diet drinks. You got to think about sports drinks have caffeine in them. You got to think about energy drinks, which are the work of the devil, by the way. People who consume energy drinks regularly have a 7-fold increased risk of suicide compared to people who don't. Yeah, fucking energy drinks, mate, are the work of the devil.
That's because the combination of stimulants.
It's all the combination of stimulants, and it's not just the caffeine, it's all the other
pre-workouts as well. That's another one you got to be mindful. People take those pre-workouts before training. You're like,
pre-workouts. If you just get your ass up for training psychologically. Don't use those pre-workout shit. Right. So that's a big one. Routine, hugely important, right? Because we have a circadian rhythm governed by your suprachiasmatic nucleus that sits right behind your forehead. And the sleep psychologist would say this is the most important one. Try to go to bed within about 15 minutes of your normal time, as many nights a week as possible, right? But even more important is to get up at the same time every morning. Right, even on weekends, right? Don't shoot the messenger, it's just the message. Because when you mess with those times, you're messing with your circadian rhythms. Now, most people don't realize lots of your hormones and your cells actually run off circadian rhythms. So when you mess with your sleep and wake time, you're actually messing with your circadian biology, which is not good. And then the other one that I would throw in there, as well as all the other ones we talked about, is that your brain needs to know that your bedroom is a sleep sanctuary. It is where you go to sleep, and if you're lucky, you get a bit of oofty magoofty every now and then, right? It is not a place for televisions, laptops, and mobile phones, right? And I know some of your listeners will be going, oh shit, I got a television. Some will be going, oh, I bring my laptop in there occasionally. The vast majority of your listeners will be going, oh, yes, I have my mobile phone, but it's my alarm clock. Buy a $10 alarm clock, you tight arse. What we know is when your phone is beside your bed, your brain is hypervigilant. Something called the default mode network, which is the resting brain chatter, is more active when the phone is beside the bed. Somebody could be texting. They could be liking that Instagram post. You should check, right? It's getting your bloody phone out of your room, I think, is really, really important. So altogether, those sleep hygiene practices. And, people want to do all of that for 2 weeks. If your sleep does not improve, you can troll me on social media.
Love that, man. Yeah, I've invested loads. I mean, we spend like a third of our life sleeping, right? If you do it right. Yeah. I've got a bloody, I got one of those koala mattresses. I'm not sure what mattress you've got. Have you got a good one?
I've got a Temper. I love the Temper mattresses.
Awesome, man. Yeah, so I've invested now. I also got the 8 Sleep as well. Like I've gone all out. Have you ever used 8 Sleep?
No, I don't. I'm quite intrigued about the 8 Sleep, actually.
Yeah, man. It's definitely helped. It's a genius how it works. And it just goes to show, right? I was thinking about this the other day. It's like as humans, we evolved, right? Naturally, back in the hunter-gatherer days, you would imagine the sun would rise, we would wake up naturally. We didn't have all this stimulation.
That's right.
weren't a thing. You know what I mean? We would hunt in the daytime. Our circadian rhythm, you would think naturally would be more in tune because that's all we had was the sun and hunting and nature, right? Here, now it's like I was thinking the other day, the amount of money I'm investing, which is great, it's an investment for me, but it's like you have to go the other way to the extreme now. Okay, now I've got to try and all this stimulation coming in, and obviously with the room temperature and stuff, that's a good thing with H sleep is it regulates the temperature of the mattress. It's really, really good investment. But also the alarm on there as well. They've got like a vibration thing on there, so don't need the phone.
Ah, yeah, nice.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And it wakes you up rather than the alarm, making you jump out of bed. But yeah, so I always talk to clients about, stress and sleep. They're the kind of the two big rocks. If one of them is off, when it comes to your decision making with food, your recovery in the gym, those things are going to be off as well, right? And
absolutely. Absolutely. The knock-on effects are huge. And you talk to any elite athlete, they will tell you sleep is a weapon.
They actually found that. It's interesting. They found that with UFC fighters, I think it was, the highest level. I think the only difference was, which is obviously that, but it's like the 0.1% advantages, right?
Yeah.
Was one of them was getting better sleep, and that's what it comes down to.
Hugely important. Hugely important.
Let's touch on sleep, right? Because I know you've mentioned, and we touched on sorry, not sleep, stress. We touched on, embracing discomfort, right? And how we have lots of stress coming in and we're not managing it properly. Because all these things are stresses, right? And stress is obviously good. We need it to adapt and become more resilient. But if we have too much of it and we're not managing it and we're on our phones, we're checking emails right up until sleep, for example, or we've got personal stress coming in, or we're even overtraining in the gym because we're not being smart. All these balancing that out, I find, is a tough act, right?
It is a really tough act, but it's a really important thing. As physiologists, we talk about eustress and de-stress. So eustress is the stress that actually makes you stronger and better, right? And de-stress is the stress that wears you down. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. We're just so overstimulated, right? So it's not just that work is stressful. It's that when we come home, we tend to be stimulated, right? And there are so many people, and I've been thinking more and more about this, who spend the vast majority of their free time with their friggin' head buried in a screen and saying, entertain me, right? On scrolling on social media, watching Netflix, all of this thing. For me, they are passive consumers of life. They're not active participants, but they're being overstimulated, right? We know that these things stimulate us. But what we should be, if you look at hunter-gatherer societies, that's when they're kind of lying around the fire, chatting and stuff like that, playing and recovering, right? So I make a strong distinction between recovery and relaxation, right? And when an elite athlete, if they're in competition and they need to get up every day to perform, I tell you what they're not doing after a really hard contest or hard day. They're not coming home and going, fucking hell, that was a hard day, I need a drink. And they're not self-medicating with shit food and sitting on their phones until 11 o'clock at night and then falling into bed and trying to get some form of sleep or drinking alcohol or whatever it may be. What they're doing is active recovery. Right. And I always say to people, sorry to burst the bubble, but recovery is not sitting with your feet up in a bottle of wine watching Netflix. That's relaxation. It is very, very different. Right. So it is, I think that recovery pace, when you look at overtraining syndrome, the thing that keeps an athlete on the peak performance edge of that tightrope is the quality of their recovery, right? So that's one thing I think that's really important in stress that people don't talk about is, are you recovering or are you relaxing? That's the other thing. The other stuff that comes into it, I think there's a couple of things here that are driving this phenomenon around not managing stress well. One is that just people's constant drive to be happy. And it's bullshit. Happiness is a very fleeting emotion and people get attached to being happy. And that causes, the research shows that when people are constantly striving for happiness, that actually increases their stress and is a vulnerability factor for mental health, right? And part of the issue here is that we try to make life not hard. Here's the thing. Life is hard, always has been, always will be. It's when people try to make life not hard that they get into trouble. because they're in their own heads, struggling with negative emotions, struggling with the way life is and the way that they think it should be, and wanting to change reality. And that a lot of the stress that people experience is self-imposed because of where the flashlight of their attention is, right? And when you have that attention shone in your own head for long periods of time, anybody who's an overthinker or has anxiety knows that's very, very debilitating, right? So that's one thing, is you need to understand that life is hard. And if life is hard, then we must follow, I think, the quote from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. He said, we must all undergo a hard winter training and not enter into lightly that for which we have not prepared. And he was talking about life. So if life is hard, then you need to prepare yourself by doing hard stuff, by exercising, by deliberately getting out of your comfort zone, because it's only by doing that that we increase our capacity to deal with stress. I think the issue today is people are shrinking their capacity to deal with stress, and we're making it worse with the way we bring up our kids and talking about managing stress and always talking to them about feelings and stuff like that and trying to save them from stress. You're just not preparing them for life. We need to be encouraging our kids to do hard stuff, and then to just be around to help them to learn the lessons from it, right? So that's one thing that's a generational thing. But I think deliberately doing hard stuff increases your capacity to deal with stress. And this is really critical because of the research literature on challenge and threat, right? Is that when you view something as threatening or as a loss, it actually activates cortisol. And the half-life of cortisol is more than an hour. So that means an hour after that stressful reaction, you still have cortisol in your system. Whereas if you view something as a challenge, it activates your fight or flight mechanism. And your fight or flight mechanism, those hormones, adrenaline, noradrenaline, the Yanks will call them epinephrine, norepinephrine, they have a half-life of less than a minute. So very quickly you come back to homeostasis. Where if you're constantly thinking about bad stuff and this is a threat and that's a threat, you're actually putting yourself in a perpetually stressed state and making shit worse. Does that make sense? So for me, it's about leaning into discomfort, right? Having that challenge orientation where this is a challenge that I need to lean into, but then making sure that you're recovering effectively so that you can go out and do the next day. Not just thinking everything is bad and, oh, woe is me, and having the victim mentality, which is just going to put you in a perpetually stressed state, which is going to impact upon your sleep, and then that'll impact on your food next day and how much you move and all that shit, right? But a lot of it comes down to your mindset around this stuff. And I think if we are to just teach every kid and for everyone to accept life is hard, and therefore you need to be prepared and you need to lean into it with a challenge mindset, I think we'd find that half this shit disappears.
100%. And
if you recover effectively as well, then
definitely,
then we're good.
And everything you're talking about there really just relates back to resilience, right?
Totally.
When it comes to mental and emotional health, I want to touch on some of your viewpoints there as well. But with physiology and actually being strong and fit, for example, going to the gym, doing exercise, eating mainly single ingredient food, right? We don't have to go down out of the rabbit hole of nutrition, but also sleep, which we touched on, which is the foundation. Without that, everything's, out the window, really. You gotta build that foundation of sleep first. When we're doing those things, it then becomes, you exercise more, you get outside, you get daylight, you move more, which we haven't touched on then. You're eating whole foods for the most part, then you tend to sleep better, right? Because you've exerted a lot of that stress.
And what you're doing is you're preparing your body for the contest of life. The Stoics said the contest is upon us. There is no time to wait. The Olympic Games of life are here. You got to friggin' prepare yourself. Like, why would you go in to something that's hard, to a competition or to battle, having completely destroyed yourself by eating shit food and not moving and not doing any friggin' training whatsoever, and then destroying your sleep? It's completely counterintuitive. Like, what's your capacity going to be like to get into that contest if that's your preparation?
Love that. And you mentioned something about mental health, which I really would like to touch on. I heard you talking about, you know, talk therapy, which is not action focused, right?
Yes.
Is actually not gonna, and I've actually unpacked this. I had some therapy and stuff. I had quite a lot of therapy a few years ago. And when I look back on it, I remember I was just so, and I mean, it is important to unpack stuff that, because I want trauma, all those kind of things. But a lot of times it was an action focus afterwards, you know, and then I was just feeling drained afterwards. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, so talking, and I've heard something recently, I don't know if it's research on it, you know, ruminating, and I find this myself, ruminating and talking about your problems makes them worse.
Talk therapy drives rumination. Talk therapy, particularly without action, drives rumination, and rumination causes depression and other mental health issues. I think schools have a huge role in this, and it's well intentioned, as was the self-esteem movement in the 1980s. They're telling everybody they're friggin' awesome, and that fucked people up. Sorry, I'm not sure if
No,
that's
no,
a
go
good
ahead,
your
man.
point,
That's fine.
but
That's fine.
I think we're doing it. This is it 2.0, where we're constantly talking to our kids about our feelings and how are you feeling today, and getting in touch with your feelings. Because what the research shows is, if you are overly focused on feelings, it is another risk factor for depression. Right? Oh, maybe I'm not feeling great, right? And particularly with highly suggestible young people, we need to stop talking about feelings, and we need to start talking about hardiness and resilience, right? That I think that is pretty key in all of this. But if you look at psychology, and I'm doing a PhD in psychology, if we look at medicine and we look at psychiatry, psychiatry is as close, and I'm not saying it is this, but it is as close to wacky made up bullshit as you will get in medicine, right? If you look at every single one of the DSM mental health conditions, of which there's over 100, there is not one single consistent biological trace or biological proven label or mechanism that you can pin on. So diabetes, you test blood sugar. Your blood sugar is over a certain level, you got diabetes. We can test for heart disease, right? We can test for every single disease. There is a very significant biological signature, and there's not one for any of the more than 100 mental health conditions, right? And the repeatability and the validity of when you go to get a diagnosis is widely different. You can go to different psychologists and get different diagnoses, right? It is as close to snake oil salesman stuff as there is in medicine, right? And lots of psychiatrists and psychologists will bristle against that. But let's look at the evidence around it, right? And if psychiatry, and particularly medications, were useful, we would have less mental health issues, not worse mental health issues, and they're getting dramatically worse, right? I'll not continue on too much down this rabbit hole, but I think what we need to do is that we need to listen to, for instance, the Stoic philosophers, and all of the ancients who just talked about action, right? What needs to be done, right? And understanding that life is friggin' hard. I think that's the first principle. That bad shit happens to good people. You will get shit sandwiches from the universe, right? The universe doesn't resolve around you. Yes, it's unfortunate what's happened to you, but what are you going to do? Are you going to sit there and wallow in self-pity and be the victim? Or are you actually going to go and take action, right? And that's where I'm a big fan of therapies such as acceptance commitment therapy, Japanese psychology, CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, which is based on Stoic philosophy, because there's always action that is attached to it, right? And I'm not minimizing any stuff that has that. Like, really terrible shit has happened to lots of people, but there's also people that just, you know, little misfortunes happen and it completely derails their life because they become the victim. There are people out there that horrendous things have happened to them, and they just pick themselves up and they get on with it, right? And I think that's more what we need to be doing, is just helping people to realize that the universe doesn't happen to you, that bad shit happens and it's unfortunate, but you need to go and do what needs to be done to move yourself forward.
And I've heard you talking about the Japanese psychology before. What is it with the quote you said? With things as they are, what needs to be done?
Yeah, that's arugamama. With things as they are, what needs to be done. So it's an acceptance, and it's the same. The Stoics talked about the same, and acceptance and commitment therapy, right? You accept that you're having negative emotions, that bad shit has happened, but what do you need to do? What do you need to do that's aligned with your values, that is going to take you towards the person that you want to be, right?
And it is super tricky. Because I'll be honest, on Friday I had something happen, right? And I know all this, right? And the framework I use is, okay, where do we go from here, right? Once you've where do we go from here?
Yeah.
And I'll sometimes have a chat with my girlfriend about it as well, just to kind of offload it and then move on. But it kind of stayed with me all day, and the next day I was fine, right? But it is in the moment, it's kind of harder. But as you take care of yourself first and foremost, that's the foundation. Without that, it's a wrap.
Yeah.
But then having those frameworks, right? Like I'd say to myself, where do I go from here then? All right. After all that, where do we go from here? All right, let's move forward.
That's exactly it.
Well, it works out to the best as well. When you always look back on these things, you go, did it make me better or worse? Better always.
Yeah, that's right. And it's, what could I possibly learn from this, right? Moving forward. And James Gross has done a lot of stuff on reframing, on cognitive reframing, and finding the silver lining. So looking back at the bad shit in your life and actually going, what could come out of that down the track, right? And it's basically then anytime that bad shit comes up that can completely derail people, is you go, yes, that was shit, but what was the silver lining, right? What was the thing that then stimulated something good out of that? And it can be years later or whatever, but James Gross has shown focusing on the silver lining improves your level of optimism, your level of life satisfaction, and improves so many different things, right? Rather than just ruminating and wishing. So many people spend so much of their energy wishing that stuff with reality was different. You can't wish reality into a different universe, right? So for me, it's wasted energy, that stuff, right? It's, yes, you have a quick recognition that was shit, but what do I need to do to move forward? That's the key thing.
Love it, right? And going back to information versus behavior change, right? We've got more information available to us than any other time in human history, and people getting fatter and sicker, right? That's the reality. So what would you say? Because people listening to this, they're going to get, stimulated, get a lot of information. And it's like, okay, if you can implement one thing, fantastic. If you can take one thing and implement it, what do you think the big rocks are, the big barriers? Because, we could talk about environment, we can talk about what impacts behavior change. What would you say is really stopping people from making permanent behavior change, implementing permanent habits, making permanent lifestyle changes? Because anyone can do it short term. But when it comes to fundamentally reinventing yourself, because that's what you do on that journey, what are the big things that you think hold people back the most?
Because it's fucking hard. That's what holds people back. Behavior change is hard, and especially in the environment that we have made, where there is comfort and opportunities to opt out left, right, and center, right? It is so much harder to be healthy now than it was 40 years ago, right? I think we have to recognize that first and foremost, because our environment is so much different, from our food environment to the work environment where we're sitting a lot, to then where we have these phones that just hijack us because they're giving us those constant little dopamine hits, right? But it's that behavior change is hard, and there's so many options for comfort out there that actually steal our motivation, right? So every time you're scrolling, it's dopamine hit, it's dopamine hit, it's dopamine hit. When you're eating shit food, it's dopamine hits. When you're watching Netflix, it's dopamine hits, right? And what that does, that free dopamine that you don't have to work for, destroys your motivation, right? What do I mean by that? Dopamine is the chemical of motivation and goal-directed behavior, right? And what has been shown now is that when you have this dopamine that you don't have to work for, right? And particularly what I call these nuclear rewards, right? Of social media and all this highly palatable ultra-processed foods. Your brain is getting blatted with dopamine all the time. The brain goes, hey, whoa, this is out of limits. So what it does is it adjusts down your dopamine receptor sensitivity, right? And you also get this crash that happens afterwards, because pleasure and pain are in the same area of the brain. So when there's too much pleasure, it will then rebalance it out towards pain.
Is that the same as like excitement and anxiety? I've heard it's like the same.
Yeah. Similar sort of stuff. It's like seesaw, right? But this whole, because your body and your brain is so driven around homeostasis, right? There's so many things that are kept within really tight limits, like your blood sugar, your pH, your blood pressure. Your body's all around this homeostasis. And when there's too much pleasure, and particularly free and easy pleasure with dopamine hits, it rebalances out. And that's why you feel shit afterwards, right? Because your body is trying to bring you back to homeostasis. What we know about dopamine that you have to work for is very, very different. When you do exercise, ice baths, those sorts of things, saunas, you actually get high dopamine that lasts for a long period of time. And that causes motivation and goal-directed behavior, right? So I think it really is this environment that we're set up. One, that behavior change is hard to start with, but two, that we have all this free dopamine out there that then destroys our ability for goal-directed behavior, right? Now, how do we overcome this? We overcome this with all of those lifestyle factors that we talked about, right? You got to get your sleep sorted. You got to get your exercise sorted. You got to get your mindset around stress sorted. And you got to get physical activity sorted, because there's so much magic that happens when you exercise within your body, right? And then for me, it's when people set goals, I always like them to align them with their values, right? So the big thing that has helped to control my drinking, because I'm Irish and I'm ex-military and I like a friggin' tipple. The big thing for me is authenticity. So being authentic is a deeply held value of mine. And so when I'm like, I'm not going to have that drink because I want to be authentic, right? That is really, really helpful. When I have people set goals, it's like, why is this important to you, right? What are your values? How does this align with your values?
I really like
it. When people do that, they're much more likely to do it. And then there's a little trick that I have for people when I'm working with people. When they have a goal, importance and confidence scales, right? So this is straight from motivational interviewing. Like, how important is this goal to you, right? And if people say it's a 9 or a 10 out of 10, I'll say, why is it a 9 or a 10? Why is it not a 2, right? So here what we're doing is we're exploring the reasons why it's important, right? Tell me more about that. So write down all the reasons why it's an 8 or a 9, why it's not a 2, right? And then we do the same scales, importance and confidence. How confident are you that you're going to be able to achieve this, right? And some people will go, well, I've tried and I've failed. It's only a friggin' 3. What would it take to move it from a 3 to an 8, right? What do you need to do? What other support do you need? Now people are engaging in this change talk. They're talking about the things that they need to do. And when it comes out of their mouth, they're much more likely to believe it. That was the big thing for me going through motivational interviewing, was learning as an expert. Sometimes I need to shut the fuck up and I need to ask people teasing questions and get them to tell me what I want to tell them. Because when they say it, they're more likely to believe it, right? And then it's like, well, then you start to create some rituals around what you need to do and write them down. I've got this little thing called a ritual board where I have a whole heap of stuff written on and I'm ticking it off on a daily basis, right? Because that ticking it off releases dopamine, a natural reward for the brain. Food, water, sex, nurturing, achievement. When you tick stuff off, you're telling your brain, hey, I'm making a difference. I'm in forwards motion towards a goal. And when your brain knows you're in forwards motion towards a goal, then you're much more likely to succeed. But here is the accelerator approach, right? That not everybody will do this, but it is almost a fail-safe mechanism, is that you think of an amount of money that you would pay to achieve your goal that would have to hurt, right? But that you would pay it if a fairy came along with a magic wand and just said, hey, it's done if you give me that amount of money. So let's just take, it's $1,000 that I'm going to lose my 10 kilos. Then I ask people, tell me an individual or an organization that you absolutely detest, right? So mine, and this sometimes annoys a few people, is the Catholic Church, right? The institution, right? Not the people who are in it, but the institution. So I used this when I was back in Ireland for my 40th birthday. I came back and I'd put on 3 kilos because I got reacquainted with Guinness. And I took $1,000 out of the bank and I went to see a mate of mine and I gave him the $1,000. And I said, if within the next month, I don't send you a photo of me standing on the scales, having lost 4 kilos, because I thought I need to overcorrect now, you're to take that $1,000 and donate it to the nearest Catholic church, right? So what this does is it works on, with human motivation, there's something called the BIS-BAS, and people can actually do this survey. Some people are more motivated by the achievement of the goal, and some people are more motivated by loss. But what the research shows is that the closer you get to the goal, the more motivation the loss of not doing it becomes, right? So we got to use this, right? We want naturally to achieve our goals, right? That will help give us motivation. But then having the fear of your hard-earned cash going to an individual organization that you absolutely detest, that is the thing that's going to give you that extra motivation. So we're working on those two mechanisms, the reward of succeeding and the fear of failure that has a significant negative consequence that comes with it. Because often people just go, oh, I didn't fail, that's all right. Or I didn't succeed, that's okay. Right? No, it's not okay. Make it not okay. Like, make it really friggin' hurt. That's the nuclear path.
No doubt you lost that 4 kilos.
Oh, real quick.
Lost it in a week. Give the gram back. Look at that, man. Hey, I could talk to you for hours. The thing is, I'm really fascinated about how the brain works, all the different chemicals, but I always think to myself as well, what is digestible for the audience in it? And for the average person, when it comes to behavior change and actually taking action, I think things need to be simplified. And what you touched on then was discipline. And I actually said this to my client just the other day. I was like, look, man, discipline can't be taught, right? It's one of those things where you just got to do the work, and it's hard.
That's right.
What's the price of not taking action? All the stuff you touched on there.
Yes.
And remind them of those things. What was it we said on that call in terms of your reason to change? Yeah. Oh, okay, so it's obviously important to you then to put the work in.
That's what I mean?
Right. After that, it's so hard to do that, right? Not talking as much. I'm doing it now.
No, and it really is, and it's really linking it to their values and breaking that goal down into a process. What needs to be done? I need to do this behavior, this, how many times a week? Write that shit down, get it on your ritual board. But then ticking it off, this is the single biggest driver of long-term behavior change, is self-efficacy, the belief that what I'm doing is making a difference, that I'm having an impact, right? Because that feeds back to the brain, hey, this is working. And here's the other thing. On the days when you're not motivated, just do something. That's the key thing. You gotta keep your head in the game, right? And I've got a list of behaviors on my ritual board, some of which are hard, and some of which are easy to do. When I'm highly motivated, do the hard stuff. When you're not motivated, just do something, because then you keep your head in the game. And you'll find that if you do something, you go and tick it off, that will give you the motivation to do something else. That's the key thing.
I'm literally going to do that today, right? Because I stopped doing it and ticking it off. It was doing something to me. It was obviously dopamine. I've just got my pen and paper here now, but I'm not ticking stuff off. I'm going to start using that whiteboard right by there again from the day now. So thanks for that, man, because that makes total sense. I was crossing them off. I know you can tick. So ticking is the best way though, right? Tick.
Yeah. So write targets beside it and then tick it off.
Done. Awesome, man. Hey, where can the audience find you, my man? Really enjoyed that. Let us know where we can find you.
Yeah, look, a couple of places. If they like the stuff I talk about, the Paul Taylor podcast. I do 3 episodes a week on that. And then my website is paultaylor.biz, B-I-Z. And then Instagram, I think it's at Paul Taylor Podcast, something like that.
Awesome, man. I'll add all that into the show notes, and I'll add your book in there as well, because I feel like that is a book that needs to be read for most people. And really appreciate your time, man.
Absolute pleasure, mate. Thanks for the work that you do. We just got to get it out there, and we got to influence people in any way they can. So keep up the great work.
Thanks a lot, my man.